Western media are sounding the alarm. The United States is suspending arms deliveries to Ukraine at a critical and extremely difficult time. Even a month-long pause could have irreversible and deadly consequences. So, what's going on? What official explanations is the Pentagon providing? What does Kyiv say, and how are Moscow and NATO reacting to this? All of this coming up in our broadcast. This is TSN.ua News. I'm Alina Turshan. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like. And now, let's get to the main story. On June 3rd, the Pentagon and the State Department clarified their position regarding arms supplies to Ukraine. Washington emphasized that this is not about a complete halt of assistance. Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell stated that the Department of Defense, and I quote, continues to offer President Donald Trump reliable options for military support to Ukraine that align with his objectives. That is, to put an end to this tragic war. According to Parnell, the approach to military assistance may be revised, but the U.S. is not abandoning its defense priorities. The department is assessing and adjusting its approach without lowering its level of combat readiness, he emphasized. Parnell also added that arms supplies are being reassessed not only for Ukraine, but for other countries as well. According to him, a review of capabilities is being conducted to ensure that U.S. military assistance aligns with the country's defense priorities. And no updated information regarding the specific quantities or types of munitions being supplied to Ukraine, or the timelines related to these deliveries, will be provided. According to him, the Pentagon must be certain that U.S. military personnel have everything they need to carry out any mission, anywhere and anytime in the world. A similar position was voiced by State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce. She stated that the U.S. has not suspended all arms deliveries to Ukraine, and that the decision made by the Pentagon the day before is just one specific situation. The spokesperson was asked whether the suspension of arms supplies to Ukraine would complicate negotiations with Russia on reaching a peace agreement, since it would, in some way, reduce the pressure on Russia. To this, Bruce replied that it was a very good question, but fortunately, it would not be a factor. Moreover, according to her, President Trump confirmed his commitment to supplying Patriot air defense systems, which have played a key role in repelling Russian attacks. Let us recall that on July 2nd, American media reported that the Pentagon had suspended deliveries of certain air defense missiles and other precision munitions to Ukraine due to concerns that U.S. weapons stockpiles had become too depleted. Politico reports that this decision came as a surprise even to those in the U.S. who are usually well informed about such matters, including members of Congress and representatives of the State Department. According to media reports, the suspension was initiated by Deputy Defense Secretary Colby and a small circle of his advisors due to concerns that certain U.S. weapons stockpiles are running low. The publication writes that even Trump's allies were disappointed by this decision and accused Colby of pushing this initiative without prior coordination with the rest of the administration or other stakeholders. The Wall Street Journal claims that the Trump administration's decision to suspend some military aid to Ukraine concerned weapons already stored in warehouses in Poland, specifically more than 24 Patriot missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missile systems, Hellfire air-to-air missiles, and over 90 Avram air-to-air missiles. According to Ukrainian officials who spoke to The Economist, the U.S. halted the delivery of all military aid, including shells and spare parts. The publication describes the suspension of arms deliveries as ominous and notes that it could hardly have come at a worse time, since in recent weeks Ukraine has endured some of the largest air attacks by Russia. It is noted that the Pentagon presents its decision as limited and temporary. However, Ukrainian officials suspect that the Trump administration is behind this move. Thus, Washington may be trying to squeeze political concessions out of Ukraine, as it did at the beginning of March. On July 2nd, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense stated that it had not received any official notifications regarding the suspension or revision of the schedules for U.S. military aid deliveries. They requested a phone conversation with their American counterparts to clarify the details. President Volodymyr Zelensky also commented on the reports about the suspension of deliveries in his evening address on July 2nd.
At the working level, all the details regarding the provision of defense support are currently being clarified between Ukraine and the United States. This includes the air defense component. One way or another, we must ensure protection for our people.
According to the Financial Times, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky will speak on July 4th about arms deliveries to Ukraine. Anatoly Aimlin, executive director and co-founder of the think tank Ukrainian Institute for the Future, explained to TSN.ua why the US might stop supplying weapons right now.
America has its own interests. And about a year ago, my fellow analysts and I conducted a study. Why can America effectively fight a war on two fronts? And back then, we clearly showed that for certain types of munitions, America has a very limited supply, and it is not capable of conducting or supporting combat operations on several fronts at the same time. That's why the question of stopping supplies to Ukraine was just a matter of time, and it depends on what, well, stockpiles are left there in America. But as for the unexpected, like the halt of the RCM, we see that both representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and congressmen were surprised by such a decision. And let's be honest, you don't have to stop the supply of what already has, approval agreements. You can conduct an audit in parallel. But they somehow communicated this decision ineffectively. It left everyone stunned, because even in Poland there are large stockpiles of American weapons that still haven't made it to Ukraine. And the question is, what will happen to them? So you could say this isn't a systematic policy, but rather unsystematic, ineffective communication. These are uncoordinated actions, and they create risks and problems not only for Ukraine. They create risks for Europe as well, and even for America itself. That's because, in this case, America looks like an unpredictable partner.
The Wall Street Journal writes that the decision by the United States to suspend military aid is extremely ill-timed. This is happening against the backdrop of a significant escalation in Russian attacks. According to the publication, Russia has sharply increased the intensity of its bombardments, using a record number of drones, including more than 5,000 hits in a month, as well as combined missile strikes. Ukrainian air defense, which is already operating at the limits of its capabilities, is facing unprecedented pressure. The situation with the Patriot systems takes center stage in the analysis. The Wall Street Journal emphasizes that this key air defense system, which is one of the few capable of intercepting Russian ballistic missiles, is already under significant strain. Russian forces have improved their ballistic missiles, such as the Iskander-M and, likely, the North Korean KN-23, which now use radar decoys that create false radar signals, confusing air defense systems and forcing them to waste expensive interceptor missiles on fake targets. Enemy missiles can also maneuver during flight, making their trajectory unpredictable and complicating the calculation of the interception point for the Patriot system. These tactics result in decreased interception effectiveness and increased costs for air defense munitions. At present, it remains a matter of debate just how much the suspension of American aid will affect Ukraine. But one thing has already become clear: the US is stepping back from the Russia-Ukraine war. This is reported by the New York Times. As the author of the article notes, in March the White House had already suspended its military aid to Ukraine for about a week, which was one of the consequences of a public dispute in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky. And since then, the Trump administration has only given more reasons to believe that the US is no longer committed to Ukraine.
The phrase "leaving the war" implies that they were involved in the war. They are not a party to the actual fighting. They are a party that supports one of the sides. But what does it mean to support one of the sides? Yes, they don't supply weapons, but they do business with Russia. We studied how Russian goods are doing on the American market. For example, the Russian agricultural sector has more privileged opportunities than Ukrainian companies. The same applies to the metallurgical sector, the sector of critical raw materials. And the economic relations between Russia and America, well, they've become a bit smaller during the war, but they haven't disappeared. So it's all just business, nothing personal, as they say. As for Ukraine, there are a few points. First, the American Enterprise Institute conducted a study last year. If Ukraine loses the war, God forbid, it will force Americans to spend more than $800 billion to support Europe. They understand this, and the Ukrainian defeat is not in their interest. The RAND Corporation conducted a scenario analysis of possible developments. They also said that a Ukrainian defeat is not in America's interest, so I can't claim that America is withdrawing from the war. It wasn't in a war to begin with. But American interests do exist, including in the stability of the region and the stability of Ukraine. And, well, we see how Trump is trying to put pressure on both Ukraine and Russia. But for some reason, it seems to me that he's putting 3 or 4 times more pressure on Ukraine than on Russia. But that's, well, a slightly different story already.
Ukraine is no longer a priority, no longer at the center of US foreign policy. At least Trump is very honest about this with Ukrainians, said MP Solomia Bobrovska, who represents the Defense and Intelligence Committee in the Verkhovna Rada, in a comment to the publication. The publication writes that it is unclear how much this pause will affect Ukraine, which is currently receiving weapons from Europe and producing its own. However, it is noted that this is an especially dangerous time for Ukraine, as Russia is launching massive strikes on the country every few days, aimed at breaking through its air defenses. Moscow is now regularly sending hundreds of drones in a single night, followed by powerful ballistic missiles that can only be intercepted by Patriot missiles. As a sign of its concern, on July 2nd, Ukraine summoned John Hinkle, the deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, to discuss U.S. military aid and defense cooperation. The Ukrainian side emphasized that any delay or slowdown in support for Ukraine's defense capabilities would only encourage the aggressor to continue the war in terror rather than seek peace, according to a statement from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Several Ukrainian lawmakers also expressed outrage at the White House's decision, warning that it would only allow the Kremlin to inflict even greater destruction on Ukraine. Hundreds of deaths from attacks on civilian targets will weigh on the conscience not only of Putin, but also of Trump, wrote opposition lawmaker Inna Sovsan on X. Drone volunteer Maria Berlinska shared her assessment regarding the U.S. halting the supply of air defense missiles. She predicts that this will lead to devastated cities, including Kyiv, as well as the destruction of factories, logistics centers, and command posts, which, in her view, is intended to weaken forces at the front. She also expressed skepticism about the possibility of relying on European partners, believing that they have slept through the last 3.5 years, produced too few missiles, and supply even less. In Berlinska's opinion, this decision is a demonstration of partnership between the U.S. and Russia, possibly with the aim of uniting against China. She suggested that the interests of Ukrainians in this situation might be ignored. The volunteer believes that the ultimate goal is to force Ukraine into a gradual capitulation. According to her forecast, when hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones start flying over the cities and it becomes impossible to shoot them down, Ukraine will be forced to sit down at the negotiating table. At the same time, one of the co-founders of the UAV Operator Training Center Dronarium Academy, Andriy Nadish, commented to TSN.ua that things will get harder, but there won't be a catastrophe.
Let Maria not bring on the storm clouds. It's not all that bad. I mean, yes, Europe missed the beginning. Yes, they hoped that everything would end without their involvement. Yes, they thought they were just spectators at the theater of war, not realizing they had a role to play, and they hadn't learned their lines. Well, war teaches like nothing else. So, everything will be fine. They'll get involved, adjust their budgets. Yes, there will be a bit of noise somewhere. Some people will protest. There will be some chaotic events as power shifts. But believe me, under the threat of war, all these gears tighten up quickly, and everything happens very simply. A significant portion of GDP is redirected towards rearmament. The creation of joint ventures with Ukraine will allow them to quickly adopt advanced technical solutions and scale them up for their own country's defense, while at the same time supplying us with products to help repel enemy attacks. That's it. There's no need to exaggerate things. Berlin is wrong here, even though I respect her. That's it. But well, of course we are dependent on the United States when it comes to the supply of certain types of weapons from them. But there is nothing, I repeat, that the rest of the world couldn't replace. It just doesn't exist. I could easily explain this to Marika, show her on my fingers if needed. As for cities on fire, we have a big problem in Ukraine. We don't know how to talk about issues. We know how to grieve, to mourn, to lament. We have about 28 synonyms for these words. We are ready to die for our land, but for some reason we keep silent about the fact that, first and foremost, it's worth killing for our land, just calling things by their real names. Therefore, of course, this threat will motivate teams working on technical solutions, that is, engineers and innovators, to implement interceptor barriers as quickly as possible in order to destroy the Shahids. And this isn't science fiction, it's reality. There is a training course. I am involved in training pilots of this class. So I can say that such specialists exist in Ukraine, and this needs to be scaled up. With the involvement of the state, it would be much easier and faster to do this. Yes, it's an expensive undertaking. Well, basically, we understand that war itself is not a cheap thing. Right. Is it a one-sided gain? Definitely not. You see how their factories are burning, right? Well, our drones will keep flying farther, carrying more, and hitting with greater precision. Right. So, the range of our strikes as of today is not inferior to their capabilities.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin has approved Washington's halt of arms supplies to Ukraine and stated that this move could help end the fighting. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov cynically noted that, as far as the Kremlin understands, this decision is related to low weapons stockpiles in American warehouses. Peskov also added that, in his opinion, the less weapons are sent to Ukraine, the sooner the so-called special military operation will end. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte expressed full understanding of the desire of the United States authorities to prioritize the interests of their own country. However, at the same time, he called for continued military support for Ukraine. Speaking on Fox News, Rutte emphasized that in the short term, Ukraine cannot do without all possible support, especially when it comes to ammunition and air defense systems. Rutte recalled that last week, at the NATO summit, the presidents of Ukraine and the United States held a meeting which, according to him, was very constructive, particularly regarding air defense systems. He acknowledged that the U.S. needs to take care of its own weapons stockpiles, but at the same time called for some flexibility on this issue. The NATO Secretary General emphasized that European countries are actively increasing their defense spending and assistance to Ukraine. However, it is impossible to manage without practical support from the United States. He concluded that it is also in the interests of the United States that Ukraine does not lose this war, because a secure Europe means a secure United States, and these things are completely interconnected. The partial suspension of U.S. aid to Ukraine will likely accelerate Russian victories on the battlefield, as has happened before, and will also strengthen Putin's intentions to prolong the war and negotiations for a peaceful settlement, writes the American Institute for the Study of War in its report. Analysts note that the previous delay in U.S. military aid in the fall of 23 and the winter-spring of 24 created conditions for Russian forces to achieve greater successes on the battlefield than they could have before. The Institute for the Study of War states that Russian forces were advancing 3 kilometers per day in Donetsk region between the suspension of U.S. aid to Ukraine on December 6, 2023, and its resumption on April 24, 2024, compared to the 6 months before the suspension of aid in December 2023, when Russian forces lost about 200 square kilometers at a rate of 1 1/10 square kilometers per day due to Ukraine's gains during the 2023 offensive, which was made possible by increased military aid to Ukraine from the U.S. and other allies. Russian forces most likely took advantage of the suspension of aid and intelligence sharing with the U.S. in March 2025 to step up their activities in Russia's Kursk region, according to the Institute for the Study of War. In addition, analysts emphasize that the U.S. decision to suspend part of its military aid to Ukraine will likely force the Ukrainian armed forces to continue conserving their resources. Ukraine's European partners are stepping up their efforts to provide military assistance to Ukraine, and the Ukrainian defense industry continues its efforts to become self-sufficient. But only the United States can supply certain weapons systems on a large scale and quickly. Ukrainian forces will likely have to ration their resources again if the United States continues to suspend weapons deliveries, the report says. Analysts emphasize that the suspension of military aid by the United States could reinforce the so-called dictator Putin's theory of victory. This theory suggests that Russian forces are able to sustain gradual advances on the battlefield longer than Ukrainian forces can resist, and longer than the West is willing to support Ukraine. According to analysts, the current partial suspension of American aid will only reinforce Putin's belief that time is on Russia's side. At the same time, the Institute for the Study of War notes that Russia is unlikely to achieve significant operational level breakthroughs in the near future. Future Russian gains, even relatively accelerated advances following the suspension of U.S. aid, are likely to remain gradual and unstable. This, in turn, will lead to disproportionately high losses for Russian troops, as they have still not regained operational maneuverability on an increasingly transparent battlefield. Analysts also noted that the Kremlin is actively using the U.S. decision to reinforce its claims that Europe should also stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. The report emphasizes that Russia remains committed to achieving its military objectives by force and is not interested in meaningful peace negotiations to end the war. Statements by high-ranking Russian officials indicate that suspending U.S. military aid to Ukraine is unlikely to force Russia into meaningful negotiations with Ukraine, as desired by U.S. President Donald Trump. On the contrary, it will encourage Moscow to continue prolonging the war. The Institute for the Study of War also noted that the U.S. decision could especially undermine Ukraine's ability to defend itself against massive Russian attacks, which would result in significant civilian casualties. According to analysts, this sharply contrasts with President Trump's stated goal of stopping civilian casualties in Ukraine. At the same time, since July, Trump has lifted some sanctions against Syria, which led to the removal of certain Russian banks, institutions, and individuals from the blacklist. This was stated in a press release from the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Many media outlets have mistakenly already reported the removal of Rosaboronexport, Russia's main arms dealer, and other companies from the sanctions lists. However, all the mentioned companies remain under U.S. sanctions under other programs. For example, Rosaboronexport was subject to 3 different sanction regimes: Syrian, Iranian, and Russian. Only the Syrian sanctions were lifted, the others remain in place. The same applies to the other companies. Russian banks also remain blocked. In your opinion, how might this decision affect the situation on the front lines? We sincerely encourage you to write to us and share your valuable thoughts and opinions in the comments section located below this video. Please make sure to stay connected and remain with TSN.ua at all times, so that you absolutely do not miss any of the most important, breaking, and significant news updates as they happen. That is truly all from me for this particular moment in time. I will now say to you, see you all very, very soon. Thank you so much for watching and for your continued, unwavering support.